Despite the mystery, two names came out as the possible fathers of President Osmeña. Or earlier of the two candidate was Don Antonio Sanson. There is no existing picture of Don Antonio Sanson for everyone's information. This is just a composite done by artificial intelligence. Who was Antonio Sanson? Antonio Sanson was a member of the Sanson clan of Parian. One of the most prominent families of Parian. They were also merchants and they were also businessmen and landowners. And in fact, Don Antonio Sanson owned a vast tract of land in Bourbon, Cebu. He spent his time in Bourbon and in Parian, and his branch of the family was also said to have come from Surigao and in Mindanao. But his roots were really from Parian as well. Don Antonio Sanson was also a juez de paz of Bourbon, which means that he was not only wealthy and socially prominent, he also had education, because the position of juez de paz, later on during the American period, it became justice of the peace. You had to have a certain level of higher education in order to have that particular position during the Spanish period. So Antonio Sanson was said to have married 3 times, or perhaps he had 3 wives. But unfortunately, what is known is that he only had 1 child, a daughter. For now, I have not been able to trace his descendants. So hopefully we will be able to do that eventually. This is the earliest reference to Antonio Sanson being the father of Sergio Osmeña. This was an article written by Vicente Soto on January 14, 1934 in the Progress newspaper. This is not a very flattering article. In fact, Soto accused Osmeña here of a lot of wrongdoing. So that's not the point of this article. What we're interested in is at the last part of this article. Let's highlight it. If you can read the 3rd part, Don Sergio, whom the latter called Tio, even if not a brother of his father, Antonio Samson. That's a misspelling, it should be Sanson, but Samson and Sanson are easily interchanged. Byongkong, his nickname was Byongkong. So that's the part, it's a very short mention, but it's a mention nonetheless. So this is the earliest reference we have found that supposedly Antonio Sanson was the father of Sergio Osmeña. In another article, this was in a monograph series in 1961, there's a portion in that article that says the most convincing evidence to date that suggests Osmeña's father was a prominent wealthy man from the city of Cebu who owned extensive land holdings in the northeastern municipality of Bourbon named Antonio Sanson. Since Sanson was already a married man, it was not possible for him to establish a legitimate bond with Osmeña's mother. Nevertheless, Osmeña eventually acquired much of Sanson's properties in Bourbon, which I believe some of them still remain in the Osmeña family. So amazing. The family has been able to hold on to the property of one of the supposed fathers of President Sergio Osmeña. And one of the most vocal supporter of Antonio Sanson as the father of President Osmeña is the American historian Michael Cullinane. Citing from John Seidel's book from 1995, Cullinane, in published writings and personal communications with Seidel, expressed doubt about the veracity of the claims that Pedro Gotiaoco was Don Sergio's father, noting evidence that suggests that the real father of Sergio Osmeña Sr. was another Chinese merchant, and that the putative kinship ties between the Osmeñas and Gotiaocos were convenient basis for a long-lasting business cum political alliance between the families. Michael Cullinane, the American author and writer, has always been a supporter of the Antonio Sanson being the father of Sergio Osmeña. One of the latest, this is a 2022 book by Michael Cullinane, The Chinese Mestizos of Cebu City, 1750 to 1900. If you can see at the very bottom of of the family tree of the Osmeñas that can be found at the last part of the book. Juana Osmeña is Suico, not married to, but meaning there was a relationship with Antonio Sanson, and their son was Sergio Osmeña y Suico. So this one is a definitive, like before it was just positions, but in 2022, last year, with the publication of Chinese Mestizos, Michael Cullinane definitively puts on paper that Antonio Sanson was the father of Sergio Osmeña. But there is a second candidate, as we already know, and supported not just by historians and writers, but also by Google, Wikipedia, Siri, and other online sources. Don Pedro Singson Gotiaoco. He was a pure Chinese. Don Antonio Sanson was a mestizo Chinese. Don Pedro Gotiaoco was a pure Chinese. He was directly from China who came to the Philippines with a rags to riches type of story. Now, this is the oldest that I can find, from 1992, from the Forbes Zibenja, Chinese version of the Forbes magazine. Gotiaoco's second wife, a Filipina, meaning Juana Osmeña, but her name is not mentioned, is said to be the mother of one of the country's most honored senior politicians, Sergio Osmeña. While there are on hand expressed doubts regarding the authenticity of Osmeña's biological relations to Gotiaoco, there is on hand no evidence available to prove the contrary. So the 10th volume, this is very interesting. According to the article, the 10th volume of a collection of Xinjiang historical documents published by the Fujian Political Association indicates that Sergio Osmeña's Chinese last name is given as Go Sibin. Sergio Osmeña appears in the documents in Fujian as a son of Pedro Gotiaoco. So they also have their own definitive putting down on paper that Osmeña was the son of Gotiaoco. But what is even more interesting for those who understand Chinese or a little of Chinese, his second name, the Si, Go Sibin. Si is 4 or number 4 in Chinese. What is interesting is that Gotiaoco already had 3 sons before supposedly Osmeña, which tells us that the given name, supposed Chinese given name of Osmeña, acknowledged him as the 4th son of Pedro Gotiaoco. So it's kind of telling also that the Chinese side in Fujian were already very confident that he is a part of our family. He is part of their family tree and already given the acknowledgement that he was the 4th son of Pedro Gotiaoco. A book by national artist for literature, Dr. Risil Mojares, The Book of Go, is a definitive book about the history of the family of Don Pedro Gotiaoco. So it's a very amazing book. So if you can get a copy or read it, try to. I'm quoting some of the interviews and references that Dr. Risil Mojares did. In his book, one of the proofs that the Gotiaoco family has also, or the supporters of the Don Pedro Gotiaoco as the father of Osmeña, have always believed was that Pedro Gotiaoco and Juana Osmeña knew each other since they lived in the same block in Parian. Now, according to Dr. Mojares, he believes that although it's most likely true that Pedro Gotiaoco and Juana Osmeña were friends and knew each other, this happened already after the birth of Sergio Osmeña. And the fact that by 1878, Pedro Gotiaoco was not yet the prominent and wealthy businessman that he was later on, it is also very unlikely that he would have been close to Juana, whose family was very, very rich and perhaps a little snobbish with people who were not of their level, obviously, because that's how it worked. You went around with your own circle at that time. So it would have been impossible that Pedro Gotiaoco would have been close to Juana Osmeña before the birth of her son, Sergio. Another quote from the book, stories are told that Juana used to buy oil and matches from the store of Don Pedro, and Pedro Gotiaoco patronized the bakery and gaming parlor, meaning sugalan, which Juana's mother, Paula Suico, operated out of their home. Antonio Sanson, by the way, was also a frequent visitor to the gaming parlor of the Osmeñas. So they probably met there. It would have been weird, no? But the three of them met also each other. Juan Osmeña, Pedro Gotiaoco, and Antonio Sanson met at the gaming parlor of the Osmeñas. 2 other quotes. Pedro and Juana were supposedly often seen going out on paseos or a walkabout around the town. And it is further told that Gotiaoco helped pay for Sergio Osmeña's education at Seminario Colegio de San Carlos and the University of Santo Tomas. Now, this particular story has also been often repeated in various newspaper articles, magazine articles, and in fact, in the book of John Gokongwei, in his biography, he mentioned that they have a copy still of receipts showing that Pedro Gotiaoco and the Gotiaoco family helped President Sergio Osmen in his early education. So all of these things were also taken into consideration by some historians and perhaps by some members of the Gotiaoco family as definitive proof that Don Pedro Gotiaoco would not have helped just anyone who was not his own blood. So that's why he supported Don Sergio in his education. So those are the things that are put together by some people to prove that Don Pedro Gotiaoco was definitely the father of Sergio Osmen. In his last years, it is said that Don Sergio wanted to tell his family who his father was. There are several people today who have heard it secondhand and some third-hand from people who knew the story that Don Sergio wanted before he died to tell his children and grandchildren who his father was. Unfortunately, his wife, Doña Esperanza Limha Osmeña, decided that it was not the right time to tell people about it. Why? When he was dying, we don't know, but probably she didn't want to rock the boat. She didn't want members of the other families to be insulted or perhaps offended if the truth of her husband's father came out. We don't know. They're all unfortunately gone. So, unfortunately, all people who knew Sergio Osmeña's father's identity are now gone.